Union Pacific's Big Boy is the undisputed king of steam. 25 machines, each weighing nearly 1.2 million pounds, were built to conquer the Wasatch Mountains without helper locomotives. No machine has ever seriously challenged that crown, except one did. The Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny recorded 7,498 drawbar horsepower, nearly 1,200 more than the Big Boy ever produced, hauling the same mountain freight on grades just as brutal. It was a locomotive that beat the biggest of them all at its own game, then vanished from memory. To understand how, you have to start with why the Big Boy existed in the first place. In the early 1940s, Union Pacific set out to solve a single daunting problem: move heavy freight over the steep Wasatch Mountains without stopping for extra engines. The answer arrived in the form of the Big Boy, a locomotive so immense that its own builder, Alco, needed special weighbridge certificates just to confirm the numbers. Each Big Boy tipped the scales at nearly 1.2 million pounds, engine and tender combined, making it the heaviest steam locomotive ever built in the United States. 25 of these giants rolled out of the Schenectady plant between 1941 and 1944, their serial numbers stamped into steel, their mass recorded in builder ledgers and company brochures. Union Pacific's public relations team wasted no time turning these facts into legend. The Big Boy appeared in hundreds of newspaper stories, trade ads, and newsreels. Its size and strength held up as proof that American engineering could conquer any mountain. The myth grew with every mile of track the Big Boy covered, setting a benchmark that no other locomotive seemed able to reach. At least that's how the story was told. East of Ogden, Utah, the rails climbed straight into the heart of the Wasatch Range. For Union Pacific's operations planners, this stretch was more than a line on a map. It was a daily obstacle that strained both men and machines. The grade averaged 1.14% over 60 miles, with sections pushing even steeper. On paper, that meant every mile demanded more power just to keep a heavy freight moving uphill. Dispatcher logs from the 1940s show how trains would slow to a crawl, sometimes stalling on the climb. The old solution was to add helper locomotives at key points, breaking up traffic flow and burning valuable time. But with wartime shipments rising and schedules tightening, the railroad needed a locomotive that could pull 3,600 tons or more over the Wasatch without stopping for assistance. Grade maps pinned to dispatch office walls made the challenge impossible to ignore. Ogden to Green River wasn't just a route, it was a proving ground. The demand for a single, unbroken climb shaped every decision that followed, pushing engineers to think bigger and heavier than ever before. Union Pacific's mechanical department faced a blunt reality before the Big Boy era. The Challenger 4-6-6-4, introduced in the late 1930s, was a strong performer, but not strong enough for the Wasatch. On paper, the Challenger delivered 97,350 pounds of tractive effort, a figure that dwarfed most rivals at the time. Yet dispatcher records and operating bulletins from the early 1940s show that even with this power, heavy freight still needed helpers to crest the grade east of Ogden. The Challenger's official specification sheets listed its maximum output, but the demands of a 1.14% climb over 60 miles routinely exposed its limits. Trains would slow, stall, or require double heading, especially during peak wartime traffic. The gap between what the Challenger could do and what the Wasatch required was not a matter of a few tons or a few minutes. It was a quantifiable shortfall, one that cost Union Pacific time, fuel, and scheduling flexibility. The search for a locomotive with more muscle, more adhesion, and more sustained power became urgent, setting the stage for an entirely new class of steam engine. 60 locomotives left the Lima Locomotive Works between 1941 and 1948, each one stamped with the name Allegheny and a builder's plate that quietly boasted of something remarkable. Buried in the test logs and engineering memos is a figure that does not appear in most railroad folklore. 7,498 drawbar horsepower, measured on a dynamometer car at speed. That number puts the Allegheny in a league of its own, higher than any other steam locomotive ever recorded in North America. Unlike the big boy's highly publicized rollout, the Allegheny's debut came with little fanfare. Yet the design brief was every bit as ambitious. The Chesapeake and Ohio needed a locomotive that could haul 10,000 tons of coal over the Allegheny Mountains, day after day, without stopping for help. Lima's engineers answered with a 2-6-6-6 arrangement, a massive firebox, and a 3-axle trailing truck to support the weight of the largest combustion chamber ever mounted on rails. The result was a machine that could generate more steam, burn more coal, and convert more of that energy into forward motion than any of its contemporaries. The test team at Lima ran the numbers again and again, confirming that the Allegheny could develop 7,498 horsepower at the drawbar, a figure captured in black ink on the official dynamometer charts. 60 locomotives were built for Chesapeake and Ohio, with 8 more for the Virginian, but only 2 survive today. In the shadow of the big boy's legend, the Allegheny quietly set the record for raw power, its achievement buried in builder records and technical bulletins rather than newsreels and headlines. The numbers tell a different story than the one most people remember. When it came to sustained horsepower, the Allegheny stood alone. Chesapeake and Ohio's planners faced a landscape just as demanding as anything west of the Rockies. The 80-mile stretch from Hinton, West Virginia to Clifton Forge, Virginia, climbs steadily through the Alleghenies, rising 2,072 feet to the summit. Dispatchers studied grade profiles and train sheets with the same intensity as their Union Pacific counterparts, searching for a way to keep heavy coal drags moving over the mountains without breaking the flow for helper engines. Every mile of the route had its own reputation. A 13-mile climb with a 0.577% grade, followed by a sharp descent, matching the 1.14% seen on the Wasatch. The Chesapeake and Ohio's goal mirrored Union Pacific's doctrine: 1 locomotive, no helpers, no lost time. For the Allegheny, that meant massive weight on drivers, over 386,000 pounds, so the wheels could grip the rails even when the cars behind reached 10,000 tons. Internal memos from the Lima Locomotive Works reveal how engineers matched adhesion to the mountain's demands, balancing the locomotive's 2-6-6-6 wheel arrangement and 3-axle trailing truck to spread weight without overwhelming the Chesapeake and Ohio's bridges and track structure. Operating records from the 1940s show how the Allegheny was dispatched for both heavy coal trains and faster, lighter freights. On paper, the design called for hauling 10,000-ton trains at 15 to 20 miles per hour. But the same locomotive could also move 5,000 tons at speeds up to 45 miles per hour when needed. The numbers pinned to dispatcher office walls, tonnage, speed, and grade, were nearly identical to those seen on the Union Pacific. Both railroads demanded a single, unbroken climb over their toughest mountains, and both settled on locomotives that pushed the limits of steam power and steel. The Allegheny and the Big Boy were answers to the same operational riddle, shaped by route profiles and the relentless need to keep freight moving without pause. Mechanical engineers in the 1940s spent as much time with slide rules as with wrenches, translating raw numbers into real railroad muscle. 2 figures dominated every locomotive spec sheet: tractive effort and horsepower. Tractive effort, measured in pounds force, is the locomotive's ability to start a heavy train and keep it moving, especially on a steep grade. For the Union Pacific Big Boy, this number stood at 135,375 pounds force, an immense figure calculated from cylinder dimensions, boiler pressure, and driver diameter. The formula, TE equals cylinder area times boiler pressure times stroke times 2 divided by driver diameter gave engineers a way to predict how much weight a locomotive could pull from a standstill or up a climb. But tractive effort alone did not tell the whole story. Once a train was rolling, horsepower became the key metric. Horsepower measures how quickly a locomotive can move a given load over distance, essential for keeping long freights on schedule. On the test track, the big boy delivered 6,300 drawbar horsepower, measured by a dynamometer car that recorded force and speed at the rail. That figure reflected real-world conditions, not just theoretical calculations. The dynamometer's chart showed how the big boy's horsepower peaked at around 40 miles per hour, matching the speeds needed for mountain freight runs. Adhesion, or the grip between steel wheels and steel rails, set the upper limit for both tractive effort and horsepower. Too much force and the wheels would slip, wasting energy. Engineers aimed for a balance, enough weight on the driving wheels to keep traction, but not so much that it stressed the track. The big boy's 68-inch drivers and 540,000 pounds on the drivers struck that balance, allowing it to apply its full tractive effort on the Wasatch grade without spinning out. When comparing locomotives, it is essential to look at both numbers in context. Tractive effort wins the battle at low speeds and steep grades, while horsepower rules on the open stretches. For the big boy and the Allegheny, these numbers were not just statistics. They defined what each locomotive could achieve on the rails. The next chapter would be written not in the machine shop, but in the court of public opinion. Union Pacific's publicity department understood the power of a good story. In the decade after its debut, the big boy's name appeared in 521 newspaper articles across 45 states, a media footprint unmatched by any other steam locomotive. The origin of that name is as much legend as history. In 1941, an Alco shop worker grabbed a piece of chalk and scrawled "Big Boy" on the smoke box of the first prototype. What started as a spur-of-the-moment gesture became the official class name, quickly adopted by Union Pacific's marketing team and splashed across brochures, newsreels, and magazine ads. The railroad poured resources into national press releases and full-page features, making the Big Boy not just an engineering marvel, but a household name. Newsreels played in theaters coast to coast, showing the locomotive thundering over mountain passes. Model train companies rushed to produce miniature big boys for children and collectors alike. The result was a locomotive whose fame ran far beyond the rails it traveled, shaped as much by headlines and photographs as by horsepower and steel. In the world of American steam, image mattered, and Union Pacific made sure the big boy's image was everywhere. C&O's Allegheny was built for headline-grabbing feats, hauling 10,000 tons of coal up the Allegheny Mountains. Yet daily operations rarely called for such displays. Dispatcher records and consist logs from the 1940s show these locomotives assigned mostly to routine coal drags, moving massive loads at a steady 15 miles per hour. The company's own technical bulletins described a design goal of 5,000 tons at 45 miles per hour. But that speed was seldom reached outside of test runs or special assignments. Instead, the Allegheny spent much of its career crawling up mountain grades, its horsepower potential left largely untapped. This mismatch between engineering promise and actual use carried a price. Each Allegheny cost C&O $230,663. A significant investment for a railroad already feeling the squeeze of post-war economics. Board minutes from the era reveal growing concerns about the high unit cost and the strain on maintenance budgets. Finance officers questioned whether so much power was justified when dispatcher doctrine favored slow, heavy drags over fast freights. As the first diesels appeared on order sheets in the early 1950s, the Allegheny's role became even more limited. The railroad had paid for a thoroughbred, but often used it like a draft horse, an irony not lost on planners tasked with balancing performance against the bottom line. By the early 1950s, The end for steam giants was already in sight. Chesapeake and Ohio's Alleghenies, once the pride of the mountain coal lines, began disappearing from the roster in 1952. Company records list steady withdrawals year by year, with the last units retired by 1959. The shift was abrupt, as EMD and Alco diesels arrived in batches, their reliability and lower operating costs impossible for steam to match. Shop bulletins and board minutes from the period show how management prioritized diesel orders, even as Allegheny still sat warm on the ready tracks. The decision was not sentimental. Dieselization meant fewer crew, less maintenance, and a cleaner balance sheet. Union Pacific, facing similar pressures, held on to its big boys a little longer. The first retirements came in 1959, with the final runs closing out by 1962. Within a decade, both the most powerful 2-666s and the legendary 4884s had vanished from regular service. Neither railroad spared much ceremony for their last steam departures. The era that had produced these titans ended not with a grand farewell, but with a quiet line in the equipment ledger, struck from service, replaced by numbers that belonged to a different age. Inside the Henry Ford Museum, Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny number 1601 stands silent, a monument to ambition and lost opportunity. Its twin, number 1604, rests under the vaulted ceiling of the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. Both are preserved as static displays, their giant frames frozen in time, each bearing the weight of 800,000 pounds of steel and history. Visitors can walk right up to the running boards, peer into the cabs, and trace the outline of the builder's plates, reminders of a machine built to move mountains, but now rooted to polished museum floors. Neither Allegheny has steamed since the late 1950s. Their fireboxes are cold, their drive rods locked, their stories told through interpretive panels, and the memories of the few who remember them working coal trains through West Virginia. On the other side of the preservation divide, Union Pacific Big Boy number 4014 returned to life in 2019 after a 3-year restoration. Today, it thunders across the western United States, drawing crowds at every stop, its whistle echoing through valleys where steam was once king. The contrast is striking. 2 Alleghenies preserved as relics, 1 Big Boy restored to glory. For museum curators and railroad historians, these survivors are more than artifacts. They're flashpoints in a debate over what gets remembered and what gets left behind. The physical legacy of these locomotives is as uneven as the tracks they once ruled. Greatness in steam locomotives is a question that resists a simple answer. Some will point to the big boys' enduring fame, the name, the headlines, the crowds that still gather as number 4014 thunders past. Others will look to the Allegheny's raw numbers, the horsepower charts and builders' plates that quietly record a higher peak than any other. One locomotive became a national icon, its story told in newsreels, model train catalogs, and coffee table books. The other spent its working life out of the spotlight, moving coal through the mountains and leaving behind only a handful of photographs and technical memos. For some, greatness means the machine that inspired awe, that carried the flag for American industry and became a symbol of power and progress. For others, it is the engine that delivered more on the rails, that could outpull, outlast, or outpace its rivals, even if few people noticed at the time. The Allegheny's record-setting horsepower and the Big Boy's legendary reputation offer 2 visions of what it means to be the best. The question lingers: does greatness belong to the locomotive that won the public's imagination, or to the one that quietly set the highest standard of performance? The answer, as always, depends on what you value most: legacy or the numbers left behind. Today, only 2 Alleghenies and 8 Big Boys remain, silent witnesses to how history chooses its champions. As preservation efforts shape which legends endure, raw achievement and public memory rarely align. Every artifact saved or lost still tips the balance. The story of these giants reminds us, what we celebrate is often not who truly led the way. Share your perspective below. Whose legacy deserves the last word?